Hello. Hi, I am Kate Drabinski, and I'm with Ideas on Fire, and I'm here today to talk about academic politics for new and contingent faculty. And we thought this would be a good idea for a webinar because it's sometimes confusing, especially as new or faculty members without a lot of power. It's sometimes hard to tell when we should get involved in things happening in our department and when not. So we're going to talk about today some strategies for thinking about that. So the way this will work is in a second, I will disappear from the screen, and what you'll see is the PowerPoint, and we'll work through that for 30 to 45 minutes, and then I'll come back. If you have questions or particular issues that you want to discuss, you can write them in this little box right here, and we can discuss them when I return. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so again, we are here for academic politics for new and contingent faculty. So on tap today, we're going to start by talking about how to recognize academic politics, and then we'll discuss chains of command and sort of learning to sort of understand and respect some of the organization on your campus and in your department. And then we'll talk about the importance of building support networks and finding mentors for especially when stuff like this comes up in departments, and it will inevitably. And then we'll talk about how to stay out of it when it's not useful to get involved, and then also when it's important to get into it, because just checking out of academic politics can sometimes be a way of checking out of the resources that you need for your own research and teaching work. So that's not okay. So we'll talk about getting into it and when to choose conflict over avoidance. And then we'll wrap up by talking about sort of the importance of keeping your eyes on the prize, what matters to you in terms of your values and your priorities in your workplace. And then we'll end with some further resources, particularly about mentorship, because I think that's a really important aspect of building a career. All right, so let's talk for a second about politics. I think sometimes we think of politics as always being some dramatic thing that's happening in your department, but it isn't. Sometimes it's just about conflict. And it's really important to remember that conflict is a normal part of any workplace, including the one that you're in the academy. And conflict can be incredibly productive. Arguing about how to distribute workload, for example, is incredibly important for negotiating power differentials, for getting what you need to build the career that you want. So that conflict can be really productive, and learning to engage conflict is a really important part of our careers and our lives. And especially for members of marginalized communities, conflict can be particularly scary, as we've often been on the losing end of those conflicts. So part of successfully navigating academic politics is learning how to engage in that conflict. But when is it actually like politics, like not actually important to your career, or conflict that doesn't feel necessary? And I think anybody who's been in the academy for longer than a few minutes knows that conflicts are often oversized because the stakes are so low. Thinking about my own workplace, the levels of conflict around what kind of coat hooks to get for offices was remarkable when I first started at my job. So sometimes conflicts are not, they take on a life that they don't need to. And some questions to ask when deciding whether or not this is politics, right? Get involved with politics, or if it's politics, like the politics that just distract, is to ask yourself, is this conflict relevant to your work? Is it relevant to your position? Is the solution to the conflict, will it actually impact you and what your priorities and values are? And it might a little bit, but you might still decide that it's not something you want to get involved in, right? So, and then also when academic politics are happening, ask yourself if you're being asked to listen, like in a meeting, to listen, or should you get more involved, right? What are you being asked to do? Sometimes we're at meetings where a conflict is developing, but we're not necessarily being asked to get involved. So ask yourself if you're really if it really does involve you. And often it doesn't, and you can just sort of ignore it, but not always. So one thing when dealing with this workplace conflict is sort of figuring out the terrain that you're arguing on. Is this a departmental conflict? And I think most academic politics happen on the departmental level because these are the people who we're most directly in contact with, but also the people who, if I want to teach Tuesday, Thursday, but somebody has to teach Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we've got an academic conflict, right? And it's usually something that happens at the department level, arguing over resources, time. That's where a lot of those politics happen. Like I said before, ask, does it directly or indirectly involve you? I remember when I started my current job, I got very worked up about who had to teach Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule instead of a Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday. And I realized that I actually prefer a Monday, Wednesday, Friday teaching schedule, and yet I still found myself fighting against it. And I had to step back and think, how does this involve me, and what do I actually want? What meets my values? That's an important part of figuring out where you fit in the terrain of the politics. And then think about what your role is in the political situation or in the conflict, and be really honest about this. Especially for new and contingent faculty, we're sometimes just listening ears that someone wants to complain, and so our job is to listen to it. Especially if we're new professors in a small department, the chair might finally have somebody to complain to, right? So try and get a sense of whether or not that's all you're being asked to do. You don't necessarily have to respond and get involved. You can just listen. Are you being asked to be a conspirator? Again, I remember when I started my current job, another person started at the same time as I did, and we often would plan before meetings, sort of think about how are we. Our big sort of goal was to have fewer meetings. We're 8 years in and we still have a lot of meetings, but it was something that we conspired about and we still regularly do. So are you being asked to be a conspirator and start or engage something? And if you are, think about whether or not that's something that you want to do. So that's part of sort of understanding what conflicts are worth getting involved in. You might also be asked to take sides, especially in larger departments that are big enough for a clique or for groups that form against each other. And if that's happening, right, think about, it's important to think both short-term and long-term. Short-term, is this a conflict I want to engage in? Long-term, is this actually, what would it do for my future to sort of cast my lot with one particular side, if it's side taking? In those cases, I think if it's possible to avoid getting involved, that's your best choice, because sides aren't permanent. And especially when you're new or contingent, getting on the wrong side of someone and you don't necessarily have the full picture of who has power, right, that can be a really dangerous thing to do. And then the next thing to ask yourself is it above my pay grade? I think that for new faculty, think about what your priorities are. Your priorities are likely to get through the new teaching that you have to do, figure out how, what kind of service responsibilities you really have to do and which ones you can say no to, right? There's a lot going on. So conflicts about sort of research funds or something might not necessarily be something that's relevant to you, right? Or that you should be taking part in. When we're contingent faculty, this is exceptionally important. We are likely, if you're a contingent faculty, you're likely being paid per class, or you're being paid, I'm contingent, I'm a teaching faculty, so I have renewable contracts, but I never forget that contingency means something different for me in terms of what's my responsibility for the department or the school. And saying no to a lot of conflict is one of the small gifts of contingency. So getting involved, very rarely will that do something positive for a contingent faculty person's career. So just keep that in mind. If your goal is to just say, continued adjunct in an institution? What do you need to do that? And chances are is to stay out of a lot of the day-to-day conflict of the department, but not always. Sometimes you need to get involved, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Another thing that's really important about the terrain of conflict is understanding who is in charge of what. So, for example, it might be a human resources issue. If something's happening, there's some sort of harassment in your workplace, or there's something that's not equitable about the distribution of resources or something like that, that's not necessarily a conflict that you need to resolve with your immediate peers. It might be a human resources issue. Don't forget, I think as faculty members, we're so used to just working on our research and in the classroom, we forget that we have a human resources department at most colleges and universities, and they have resources for resolving some conflict. Is it a Title IX issue? Is there some kind of gender or sexual-based harassment? Don't forget about those offices if they're on your campus. Do you need sort of an outsider to negotiate conflict? That might be the job of the ombudsman. So if you're facing a lot of politics in your current academic setting, think about what are other resources on campus to help you work through those issues. And these are often sort of last resorts for a lot of faculty, but in some cases they should be first resorts. So don't forget that they're there to help you. And then again, ask yourself if it concerns you directly or indirectly. And if it doesn't, that's a good reason to sort of step out. And then finally, universities have lots of policies and procedures to help with conflicts that will arise necessarily because we're working with other people, and that means conflict. So it's worth looking through your faculty handbook to get a sense of what the rights and responsibilities of faculty and administrators, and that can help give you a sense of what about the political situation is important and who to go to if you need help. So I think the most important part of, well, that was a lot to say. I think one of the really important parts of starting a new job as a new faculty member or as a contingent faculty member is to build support networks at the university and not just in your department. So one of the things you want to ask yourself is, who on this campus can I trust? And sometimes that's members of your department, but often it's people who are outside the department. Someone who works at the faculty development center, or your contact at the writing center, or faculty in other departments. Many of us are interdisciplinary scholars, so we likely have multiple academic homes. Think about who you can trust there. And it's often people who don't have an immediate interest in the resources of your department, because there can often be a sort of an underlying sense of scarcity within a department that can create untrustworthy relationships. So having allies outside the department are really important. So make those connections across campus, and this can take some time. So as a contingent faculty member, you've got to think about what's your priority. Are you going to keep teaching at this place? Does it matter? Or are you just trying to gut through, the 5 classes and then you're going to leave? But if you're going to stay, or you want to stay, making those connections can be really important, not just for negotiating conflict, and not even just for the hope that you've got enough allies to help you move forward with your career, but also just while you're working at a place, it's nice to have friends. So make those connections across campus as you can. It's also really important to have outside support and people who are not necessarily academics, so that you've got listening ears that aren't invested at all in the conflict itself. Because sometimes, especially if you're a smaller school, you might be having a conversation or complaining about something, or with somebody in another department, and it doesn't take long for it to boomerang back, right? And you can avoid that by keeping some of your own politics outside of that, and talking with friends, and then also with professional support therapists, people who can help you articulate for yourself what your values are and what matters to you in your workplace. When you're looking for allies across campus, one way to do that is to think about who shares your worldview, but also who could be a mentor. So look for people who are maybe in positions that have more seniority than you, have a better sense of what matters on the campus than you do, and actually ask them if they'd be willing to mentor you. And in my experience, people are generally really open to that, especially if it's something like a coffee on campus when you're both on campus, just a way to sort of build relationships that can help you understand how to navigate the academic world you're in, because it's always really, really particular to where we are. So now I want to talk a little bit about the importance of staying out of it. So academic politics generally concern conflict over resources, and those resources are time, space, and money, right? So time, what time is being extracted from me for things like who has to be on the committee, who has to teach these classes that take more time or at times that people don't want them to be. Space is a huge one. Who gets to teach in what room? Do I get an office with a window? And then money. Money is probably the biggest one. Who gets department resources for graduate student assistants? Who gets summer funding? Who gets research funding? Who gets to go on which trips? So this kind of these resources, conflict is just a natural part of that, and part of, I think, being a successful academic is figuring out when that conflict is worth getting into or not. So when those conflicts occur, I think you can ask yourself some questions to figure out whether or not it's a fight worth getting into. So first, are these resources that concern you? I am contingent teaching faculty. Research funds are, sadly for me, not relevant. So when there are arguments happening in faculty meetings around the distribution of research funding at the university level or at the department level, I just stay out of it, right? That's the time when I return to my computer, post some pictures of cats on Facebook or something, and then wait for that to be over, right? If the resources don't concern you, you don't necessarily have to get involved. It's different if you're working as an ally with someone, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And one can think to oneself, oh, of course these resources concern me, or this conflict concerns me. But take a minute and actually try to articulate your own needs in relation to the conflict. What need of mine will not be met if I don't get involved in this, or if I don't, if this conflict is settled in a way that I don't like? How will it affect what I need? And that can sound very selfish, but that's part of what we need to do as new and contingent faculty members, is to be selfish with our time and our energy. So it's worth doing that. And then finally, what is your position and what do you stand to gain or lose by becoming involved? So if you're a contingent faculty member, there's often a lot to gain by becoming involved, like fighting for, articulating in meetings where a class schedule is being set, for example, what you need as a contingent faculty member, that you need to only be on campus these 2 days and to teach back-to-back classes because you've got other teaching work in another university or something. Making those needs known is really important. That said, if you don't stand to gain or lose anything by becoming involved, or you don't stand to gain anything, then it might be worth stepping back. And if you can lose something like your position or resources by becoming involved, it's worth considering staying out of it. And this also, fortunately, gives us a lot of practice in what we could all likely get better at, and that's saying no. So ways to say no without saying no is with your being sort of cultivated into taking a side or having a position. For example, one thing you can do is just listen to that. right? Engage in active listening so that the chair, whoever in the department, understands that you care. That's maybe all they need, right? So you can actively listen, and then you can practice politely refusing to engage. You can say, "Oh, these are really important issues for the department. I'm glad we're discussing them. I have to go teach," something like that. You can sort of get out from the conflict without fully engaging. And this is a good practice for saying no and getting out of things that you don't want to do, which is important for all of us in our work and sometimes personal lives. But sometimes it's important to get involved in the conflict. So these are some sort of things to keep in mind when thinking about getting into it and actually engaging in the conflict. When is the conflict worth engaging? And this is a hard question, and there are answers on multiple scales, right? Sometimes the conflict is worth engaging because it directly affects me and my work environment. So a conflict about teaching times or who gets funding to go to the conference, that directly affects me. So I'm going to actively engage if there's conflict around that. And sometimes there's conflict that's doesn't necessarily affect you individually, but it affects things that you value. So, for example, I am contingent faculty, but I have renewable teaching contracts and higher pay and benefits than the adjuncts in my department. One of my values, though, having been an adjunct and having held lots of contingent jobs, is to move resources to adjuncts when I can. So when we're setting up a course schedule, for example, it's worth it to me and my values to engage the conflict and say, hey, can we make sure that our adjuncts have better teaching times, days and times, right, to sort of protect them. So it's not directly about me, but it's about something that I value and care about. On the university level, there can be issues, again, that affect our values. So where I teach, we've had a lot of conflict around our Title IX office and some of the reporting that the school has done, and that matters to me. And so I engage in conflict around that, right? As we move forward as a university and dealing with issues with the Title IX office, I want to make sure my voice is in there saying, hey, let's not just expand policing. Let's think about other resources to amend harm. Right? So sometimes conflicts at the university level are worth engaging because your voice needs to be there. And this is when you've got to figure out what your priorities are. If I were an adjunct here at this institution, I may not be as engaged in those university level things, not because I don't care about them, but because my list of priorities, making the institution stronger, might be way down on my list, right? So figuring out which of those conflicts to engage is incredibly personal, and it's worth taking a few minutes and thinking about what actually matters to you about your workplace. What's your relationship to it? Is part of your job to make that institution stronger, or is the institution just a place you like drop in, do your work, and then go home and live the rest of your life? Think about what your priorities are in terms of what conflicts at upper scales are sort of worth engaging. Sometimes you're faced with having to start something and to begin the conflict. And that can be particularly scary for new and contingent faculty members because we often feel like we have and we're often correct, that we have very little power in a situation. So again, think about what your values are, what really matters to you. And then choose sort of rather sort of being mindful and choosing to engage or begin a conflict, that's much better to sort of start from a position of reflection and active decision making rather than, say, popping off in a faculty meeting, which I did recently, and starting a conflict that you didn't mean to. So think about what matters to you. And when you decide to start a conflict, start right away thinking about who your allies might be in this political moment. So, for example, if I want to teach summer school for example. I want to teach summer school and I want to teach a fully online class so that I can travel and do my research while I'm teaching. And the department head doesn't believe in fully online classes. And it's important to you for both your financial life to teach summer school, but also your research life to teach it online. That's the kind of conflict that you might start as a newer contingent faculty member. And when you start that, you want to think about who your allies are. So for that conflict, for example, I would see who else in my department taught summer school, who else maybe is a mentor who understands my financial needs or something like that. And I might have, look outside of the department for allies and say the faculty learning center, if you have something like that on campus, somebody who could make an argument that online classes are pedagogically sound, right? Think about who could support you in asking for what you need, right? And then think about what your specific and particular demand is. Part of politics is making a demand, so we've got something to argue about. And I'm making it sound like we're having these blow up fights at all our faculty meetings over who gets to teach summer school. And I know that's not the case, but thinking about what we want, and rather than complaining about it with our, those couple of colleagues over drinks or something, actually thinking about who to demand, what to demand from whom, and who can help you is part of figuring out how to navigate politics in a way that's helpful to you, right? And finally, have a backup plan if your demand can't or won't be met. What else can you do, or what do you need, or how would you save face in those moments, right? So I might, my backup plan to my fully online class might be a hybrid class. Can I teach it as a hybrid class? So I do only some in-person meetings and some online, and that's sort of a bridge to the fully online class. That's maybe a backup plan. So just figuring out what you need, who to ask for it, and who can help you get what you need, that's politics, and it's politics worth doing. So never be afraid to do those things. It's just worth taking the time to reflect and see who can support you in that. So I wanted to wrap up today by talking a little bit about how important it is to think about really seriously what your priorities are at your workplace. If it's to make the workplace a better place to work, you may engage in politics that someone who is just going in to teach and leave, what they might be willing to get into. So think about what your priorities are, right? So some of my priorities include building, I want my workplace to be inclusive people. And so I'm actively engaged in political conversations on campus about what that can look like, right? So that's a priority. So that kind of political engagement is important. So think about sort of where you are and what matters to you, so that you don't sort of just knee-jerk get involved in all the crap happening on campus all the time, right? And next, another thing I wanted to point out is that you can also think about how to demonstrate your involvement in an issue without actually getting involved. And part of this is the campus politics of looking like a good departmental citizen without it stealing your soul, So there are, just like for students, they don't always have to be talking, but that they're engaged because they're like nodding, or their eyes look alive, or they're taking notes. Those things work, I think, at the faculty level too, like showing up to the meeting and listening, even if you don't say anything, right? You don't have to actually get involved. You can be the listening ear in the hallway for someone. These are ways to be a good campus citizen without getting sort of sucked in and under all that stuff. And then also consider the social aspects of engagement for good and for ill. So sometimes getting involved in conflict is good for your career's social game, right? That it's that looking like someone who's got, going to actively engage in stuff, that can sometimes be good. It can also sometimes be seen as a negative, especially if your department's big enough to for people to take sides. So just think about that before you get engaged in terms of what feels like it might help my career and help my sense of being at home in a place, and what is maybe would draw me away from that. And you're making those decisions based on limited knowledge, because you know, when you're new and contingent, you have no idea the many, the decades of conflict that have built up to make this one, what from your new perspective can seem like a silly, tiny conflict, into something really big. So just think about that. And if you can work with your mentors to get a better sense of like the kind of ways that people on your campus do conflict, that can also be really helpful. And so just finally today, you'll get these slides in your email, and we have some links to a number of resources at Ideas on Fire that can help with this. We have a whole series on cultivating mentoring relationships that I think would be really helpful for figuring out who your allies are and developing allies for the inevitable conflict and politics that will occur in your academic life. We also have a recent webinar that we did on wellness for academics and cultural workers, and I thought this might be helpful because it can remind you that you're more than the politics in your department. And sometimes the politics can get so heavy, and they can feel so much like they're taking us away from why we started doing this work, right? We got into it because we're smart, we're creative, we love teaching, we love research and writing. That's what we want to do, and yet we find a whole bunch of time spent at these meetings arguing about what kind of coat rack to get, and why Jane gets to teach in that classroom and I have to teach in this other one. We get sort of bogged down in that stuff, and we can forget the sort of the rest of our academic life, but then also the rest of our life that's outside of this place, because this is a workplace, right? And it doesn't encompass all of our life. So this webinar can give us some ideas about how to keep the parts of our life like exercise and nourishing food and mindfulness, how to keep those parts of our life active as well. And then we also have a list of daily self-care strategies that can help you with a daily pick me up when the meeting goes south, as it inevitably will. All right, so I'm going to come back now and see if anyone has anything else they'd like to discuss. Hi, so I'm back. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar. Did anybody have any questions or issues happening directly in their departments that they might want to talk about? If you do, you can type it right there. And apologies for the messy office. I feel like you're all seeing my underwear drawer, which is rough. Oh, I'm just seeing this question now, sorry. I've learned that the HR and Title IX office and the Dean of the faculty have refused to deal with abusers and instead put them in leadership positions. What do I do now? Oh, that's a really hard question. Because those are the places you would go mostly for that kind of help. And I think that's, I'm just gonna pull up the question again so I can read it again. So my suggestion would be to talk to other faculty. If you have a faculty senate, if you have other sort of feminist faculty on campus, and get together and talk about what other people have done. One of the issues that we had at my campus was everybody knew that this one biology professor was really inappropriate about women in his classroom. And I filed a Title IX complaint. I had multiple students file a Title IX complaint, and it went nowhere. And I talked to other people on campus, like, what's going on? And I realized that it was an open secret. Everybody knew. I was like, well, why hasn't anybody done anything? And it was really helpful to get in touch with other faculty who'd faced this issue. once you've learning that HR and Title IX, who shouldn't be doing this, or the problem, you might have to go up the chain of command. Is there, if you have an ombudsman, that can be a place to go, or if you can find full professors, people who have sort of more power than you can talk to them about how to organize around this. But that's a really tough question. And I wish I had a better answer for you. What ended up happening where I am is that we got enough people to make the same complaint to the Title IX office that he was censured, but nothing else happened to him. And I was really frustrated by that. And it became clear to me that other people were just waiting for him to retire. And he did retire, but it was really frustrating to watch these systems that are supposed to help us not actually help us. So that would be my suggestion, is to organize with other faculty. And you might have to then go above the dean to a provost level. But if I were new or contingent, I wouldn't want to be doing that by myself. I'd want to actually do the work to develop a coalition to do that. Anyone else have a question or concern? It's really hard. It's really hard to navigate. I just had to do it this afternoon, and was reminded again that sometimes it's not best for me to be completely honest with what's happening in my professional life with my chair. And it was fine. It all worked out fine. But there are those moments when I'm like, oh, right, this is a workplace. So I hope we all find sort of solutions or ideas of ways to approach this, and know that conflict doesn't always have a great outcome, but we learn a lot from navigating it as we do. So thank you all for joining us today, and be on the lookout for next month's webinar. And again, thank you. Bye-bye.